in 2001 that Epstein had ties to intelligence. But it also talks about his ties to other people, including Bill Gates. That article from 2001 in the Evening Standard says that most of Epstein's money came from three people, his business links to three people. Leslie Wexner, who we all know about, right? But the second one is Donald Trump, and the third one is Bill Gates.
What? What the fuck?
Okay, so in the early 90s, Leslie Wexner and the Bronfman brothers co-found this group that is referred to years later in the Wall Street Journal as the Mega Group or the Study Group. Okay, you look at Leslie Wexner, you look at the Bronfmans, you look at Michael Steinhardt, who's also a member of a well-known hedge fund manager, and a bunch of these other members. If you look at their histories, it's abundantly clear that they all have ties to organized crime, specifically the National Crime Syndicate, which is basically was formed in the 1920s. It was a union of the Jewish mob and the Italian Mafia. And pretty much all of these guys, whether it's through their parents or through other things that came out in media, years later, in the case of Leslie Wexner, they all have direct ties to organized crime, the specific syndicate, as it were. But what they have done is that a lot of these guys are very wealthy. They have rebranded as philanthropists. They're a philanthropic group. But of course, if you look at the history of quote unquote philanthropy, it's been used by billionaires with ulterior motives for over 100 years, going back to J.D. Rockefeller, who essentially tried to launder his horrible reputation with the general public by promoting his philanthropy, which of course he was only giving away like 2% of his wealth or something, but it was able, it was this huge public relations push. And this is something that billionaires and oligarchs in the US and other countries too have done ever since. What's notable about the Mega Group, though, and the same National Crime Syndicate, is that they have ties, very deep ties, to the political and intelligence apparatus of both the U.S. and Israel. If you look at members of the Mega Group, like Ronald Lauder, for example, close ties to people like President Trump, big funders of mainly Republican politicians in the U.S., as well as major funders of Likud party politicians in Israel, right? And so you see a lot of political influence of this group in both countries, and they set policy to a big extent in both countries as well, right? So in my opinion, if you're looking at this group and you try and understand how power really works at the supranational level, even though we know that like Epstein, his sexual blackmail operation was connected to Israeli military intelligence or Israeli intelligence in general, my opinion is that he was really employed by this group, the Mega Group. I mean, that's who he was really working for, because that's who's setting the agenda in both countries. As an example, Leslie Wexner gave like millions of dollars to Ehud Barak for unspecified consulting services at some point. Ehud Barak is, former head of military intelligence, was apparently he was head of military intelligence when Epstein was allegedly recruited by Robert Maxwell in the 1980s, and had close ties to Epstein that are, public record at this point, right? So, I mean, the Mega Group is something that doesn't get talked about a lot because a lot of people want to keep this at the nation state level. They don't want to go into like where power really lies, which are in these supranational networks, where the real money and power of the world is concentrated.
Yeah, so you said a lot of important information there. One of the things that I caught in the article, let me see if I can find it. You mentioned that I think it was the Washington Post. Somebody had originally reported on a separate scandal that was going on, and they mentioned Mega, and they sort of referred to it as if it was an individual, or they thought it may have referenced the FBI or the CIA. But it seems like you found a pretty early reference to what probably was the Mega Group, before it had any official name, or maybe even that's not even the real name they call themselves, right? And then also you mentioned a couple of things about the Jewish Mafia, the Israeli power, which we've talked about here, and specifically the Likud party. Now I want to say that in my history on YouTube and putting out videos, I've only had 2 videos taken down by YouTube, and taken down since there was no appeal, there was no option. One of them was recently, and it had to do with COVID-19 and me talking about vitamin C, which, okay. And the other one,
how dare you talk about vitamins, Derek?
Yeah, I know. I can't talk about anything other than the vaccines. The only other one I had removed, though, over the last 8 years of doing YouTube was an interview with 9/11 researcher Christopher Bolin discussing the
Mm-hmm.
Likud party and their role in just the influence of that
Right.
party on 9/11 and other operations. So it's clear that the power lies, as you said, in supranational groups like the Mega Group and probably others. And Wexner has also done a good job using that whole philanthropy method of changing anything and I guess keeping the public from looking in his direction. He's been able to maintain a life of relative obscurity. Most people don't have any
Yeah.
idea who he is, and or his connections going back to Ohio and to the Mafia there and everything. And what do you see though now? I guess the dust is settled. I did an article covering your recent interview with Maria Farmer where you discussed, and we've seen the news recently that the co-conspirators are now off the hook. The co-conspirators are not going to be
Yeah.
tried or, and held responsible in any way. And one of those potential co-conspirators, maybe at least in the sense of funding and providing the home, could have been Les Wexner. But again, most Americans, most people in the world have no idea who he is other than maybe buying his company's products and using those. Where do you see it going as far as Wexner? I mean, do you think he's just going to live out his life and die of old age and never be held responsible, or do you think there's any opportunity here for truth to come out about him and the Mega Group in general?
The opportunity for truth to come out lies entirely with independent and alternative media. The mainstream media has clearly dropped the ball on this. They are not interested in reporting this aspect, the Wexner aspect of things. If anything, we can see that from how Maria Farmer went to all these mainstream media journalists, and they would publish a lot of stuff she would say, but they wouldn't really get into the whole Wexner deal. How she said that he was the head of the snake of this operation in the U.S. when she called the FBI, among other things. That she disclosed in this phone call that I released publicly, right? Or at least the first second part will be out soon. So honestly, for people to really know what Wexner was into, this of course lies with independent journalists exclusively. As an example, this really talented local Ohio journalist, Bob Fitrakis, he was following Wexner and Epstein throughout the 1990s, reporting on a lot of shady stuff they were involved with, including the CIA front company, Southern Air Transport. And, when this whole scandal broke with Epstein, a lot of information that he had put out there was public record, and mainstream media knows that these stories are out there, particularly, the one where Fitrakis, obtains this police report that was supposed to be destroyed that directly links Leslie Wexner to the homicide of his former tax attorney and links him directly to organized crime, the National Crime Syndicate that I mentioned earlier. This is public record, but why would mainstream media not report on this? It's because there's an interest in not reporting on it, because there's I forgot to mention earlier, this National Crime Syndicate got in bed with intelligence in World War II. With the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA, and then those ties deepened once the CIA was created, and then they established ties with Mossad because they helped arm the Zionist paramilitaries that created the state of Israel. So, they have longstanding ties to the intelligence communities of both countries. So obviously, once you start pulling on one string, whether it's the mafia side or the intelligence side, you're going to get to the other side of the story. And I think mainstream media knows if you pull on any of those strings too much, the whole thing will start to unravel, and it's harder to cover up the reality of the situation. What's going on, of what, the core of what the Epstein case is really about, which is that, this is state sponsored and it's most likely still going on. Epstein was a project manager. He wasn't the boss. The operation doesn't end with him, right? It continues most likely because, he was just a front man for this operation, by all indications.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important, like you said, that he's just a part of the puzzle, maybe just a project manager. He's definitely not the leader, though. And I did find it interesting that Maria Farmer said that Wexner was the head of the snake, because it's clear that he's obviously a powerful, influential person. Nobody is able to basically erase their history and keep themselves out of the limelight that easily without having some power and influence. So let's move forward now a little bit and explore some more of the Mossad intelligence side of things. I'm looking at your other article here, how the CIA, Mossad, and the Epstein network are exploiting mass shootings to create an Orwellian nightmare. And, I can see in the background we have things like Israeli Unit 8200, we've got Carbine, we've got other companies. Let's start exploring that, because a lot of the companies that are out there, even for Americans and people who don't know their names, products are, as you said, being now promoted as the solution to COVID-19. And the various players that are trying to build the technocratic state are using this crisis to their advantage. Like we know that the state will. Let's talk about that, though. What do you see happening now in relation to what you wrote back in September and what's happening now?
All right, so I sort of alluded to this earlier. A lot of the systems being rolled out now that they're saying are going to be used to quote unquote protect us from COVID-19 were actually created or announced publicly really last year, and their justification for those programs was we have to stop mass shootings in the U.S. before they happen, because at the time, what Americans were most afraid of because of media hype last fall were mass shootings. So now the media hype is different. And so the justification, it's the same solution, but the justification has moved to what Americans, by and large, are currently most afraid of, which is coronavirus. So these are solutions that the national security state has long wanted to implement. And they are just looking for whatever justification will stick so they can get enough public consent to really ram this through and have it widely adopted. So in terms of my CIA Mossad mass shootings article, this article is massive. I highly recommend you just read it because I wrote it a long time ago, one, and two, there's just so much detail that I won't be able to, voice in this interview. But there's a lot of stuff there that I think is really important. But some key takeaways. There are a network of companies that are present in the U.S., used by the U.S. government, that are involved in mass surveillance, that are basically a fusion of Israeli intelligence and American intelligence. There's a lot of overlap with Israeli Unit 8200 and the CIA. And we see this. I'll give one example. There's this startup incubator based in Israel. It's called Team 8. It's led by the former commander of Unit 8200. It recently hired Mike Rogers, who's the former director of the NSA and US Cyber Command. Its main funders are Microsoft, Cisco Systems, and Google's former CEO, Eric Schmidt, right? Eric Schmidt, Microsoft, and Cisco are all represented on the National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence that's about introducing artificial intelligence into the economy right now. I wrote an article about this recently because a lot of the stuff they wanted to see change in U.S. society, the obstacles to the adoption of a lot of these technologies and mass surveillance systems are systematically being removed under the cover of coronavirus. But another aspect that I talk about a little bit in the CIA article is a company called Carbine that Epstein himself was funding. Ehud Barak is the head of it. And it's basically replacing the 911 call system in the US to basically, when you call 911, it takes all the data off of your smartphone. And with that data, it not only analyzes your history and what you're doing at the present, but also predicts what you will do in the future. And there are a lot of different pre-crime elements that are already in place. Another one being Peter Thiel's Palantir. Another one being the Department of Justice's new program that started just this year that hardly anyone knows about, called the Disruption and Early Engagement Program, or DEEP, which is a pre-crime program. They can arrest you if they think you are, quote unquote, mobilizing towards violence. Okay. This exists now. He announced it last October. It was hardly reported on. I think I was the first person in independent media to cover it. But Huffington Post covered it, but they said, oh, what a great program. Bill Barr is going to stop mass shootings. This is great. And I was like, no, it's actually not. Because there's like this pre-crime dragnet that they're creating that's really based on artificial intelligence, that the algorithms are going to determine who's mobilizing towards violence and who's not. And last year we saw all these other things come out too, like conspiracy theorists or a domestic terror threat, for example, and they're going to be combing through social media history. You had Ivanka Trump promote this HARPA Safe Homes program that was about trying to identify mental illness in Americans from their social media history and their smartphone usage. That was one of the main scientific advisors to that program is the former head and founder of DARPA's Biological Technologies Office, which has developed a lot of these new systems that are being promoted under coronavirus to prevent the next pandemic, including these injectable biosensors that will determine if you're going to be sick with coronavirus 3 weeks before you show symptoms. and are going to connect to a smartphone app in a national database. I mean, all of this stuff is being promoted now. This contact tracing stuff. All of this, like I said, was in place last year under the guise of mass shootings, and it's companies connected to Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence. And like I said earlier, this national crime syndicate that has a lot of connections to Epstein. They have connections to, the intelligence communities of both countries. But even beyond, that syndicate, the CIA and the Mossad have worked together forever, really. If you look at the history going back to the CIA's first counterintelligence chief, James Jesus Angleton, who really forged that CIA Mossad tie from the really earliest days of both agencies. So, it really honestly makes sense. They have similar agendas, and those agendas are mass surveillance and control. And it's interesting too, just to see how transparent this agenda is. One of the first countries to do this contact tracing mass surveillance program under the guise of coronavirus was Israel. It was managed by Shin Bet, which is basically like Israel's FBI, right? That's been doing this pre-crime detention crap with Palestinians for a really long time. Anyway, they said they were going to do this to fight coronavirus. They're doing this contact tracing stuff. And then this prominent association of Israeli doctors come out and say, please stop this program. It's making it harder for us to respond to the crisis because it's not giving us data that is useful to us as doctors. Instead of Shin Bet saying, how can we tweak the program so we can get useful information to doctors, they do nothing and they keep the program in place. This is because the information they are getting is useful to them. It's not about doctors. It's not about healthcare. It's about expanding the national security state. And I've written a ton of articles about this in the past, but if you look at what's been going on in U.S. tech in recent years, this is about building a binational security state and essentially fusing a lot of operations of Israeli intelligence with U.S. intelligence. There's a lot of, for example, this company Cyber Reason I mentioned earlier, they're running on the Pentagon's and CIA's most classified networks, and they most definitely have a backdoor into all of it. Actually, Cyber Reason's CEO says that his work at Cyber Reason is a continuation of his work of Israel's Unit 8200, which is like Israel's NSA, basically. And they run antivirus software on all of these ostensibly secretive, secure networks. And then you have, people like the former NSA director joining Team 8, which is run by Unit 8200 guys, and you have Silicon Valley guys like Eric Schmidt and Peter Thiel funding all these Unit 8200 startups. You have, really prominent information system officers from the CIA joining the boards of Unit 8200 Israeli companies, including Carbine 911, including another company called Sepio Systems, whose chairman of the board is Tamer Pardo, former Mossad director. I mean, it's all very insidious. And in my opinion, it's a binational security state. If you look back to where this policy started, it was in 2012. It was Benjamin Netanyahu, and it was Zionist billionaire in the U.S., Paul Singer, planning basically to do this so that the U.S. could never boycott Israel, ever. Just to eliminate BDS forever, making it impossible for the U.S. government to ever boycott or divest Israel, or, in the consumer sense as well, by making Israeli intelligence-linked tech companies so enmeshed in what the U.S. does that they could not be separated. And that's they admit this in 2012.
But yeah, essentially you have the national security states of the U.S. government and the Israeli government completely interconnected and meshed together, as you said, and making it more and more difficult for people to avoid it. Because whether Americans or Israelis are aware of these connections, the devices, the technology that is going to underpin everything that is being built, what I've talked about in recent months and years, the 5G network, the smart grid, which is is basically the backbone of the Internet of Things and the technocracy. All of it is being built together with these companies and these firms that go back again to linking to the network of Epstein and the mega group. And they also link to some other people that I wanted us to get into that you've written about. And some of these reports actually have been scrubbed from the internet. I don't know if you found them yourself or somebody reached out to you, but they were a great find. I'm talking specifically about your other article for Mint Press called "These Scrubbed Reports Reveal New Secrets into the Prince Andrew-Jeffrey Epstein Relationship." But they also go into Bill Gates and Donald Trump. So if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about that and how you came across that information and why maybe it might have been scrubbed.
All right, so I have a longtime reader who's a university professor, and I asked him to put in certain terms into LexisNexis, which searches all these newspaper databases, to see if I could find some of these scrubbed articles, because I knew this one article from 2001 that was written in the Evening Standard by Nigel Rosser. I know this exists because it's quoted in a lot of Bob Fitrakis. I mentioned him earlier. In some of his reports, he references this article because he's quoted in it. But it's been scrubbed. And the main reason I would argue it's been scrubbed is because it openly talks about people that Nigel Rosser had talked to. He doesn't name them, but that were telling him in 2001 that Epstein had ties to intelligence. But it also talks about his ties to other people, including Bill Gates. That article from 2001 in the Evening Standard says that most of Epstein's money came from three people, his business links to three people: Leslie Wexner, who we all know about, right? But the second one is Donald Trump, and the third one is Bill Gates. And to do Bill Gates first, if you read mainstream media reporting on when Bill Gates and Epstein met, they originally said, I think it was like 2016, and then the New York Times did like a very limited hangout expose, and they were like, actually, it was 2011, trying to be like, oh, we scooped Bill Gates, but actually, it actually goes back to the 90s. In 2001, they were saying he made a bunch of his business, a bunch of his money with Bill Gates. If you know anything about the history about Jeffrey Epstein, you would do business with him during that period of time because you were either money laundering or there was he was running, blackmail for you or some other sort of shadow finance deal. I mean, definitely shady dealings. Jeffrey Epstein started his career with intelligence in the 1980s, doing shadow banking, involvement in insider trading. It appears he had ties to BCCI. He was doing, banking for people like Adnan Khashoggi, who was an intelligence asset for multiple intelligence agencies, right? So if you're someone like Bill Gates and you're, doing a lot of, business stuff with Epstein, when the main things, Epstein was doing in that period of time, besides sexual blackmail, was money laundering, it makes sense why Bill Gates would want to cover this up, especially with all this information that's come out about Epstein now. Right. But that should really, alert people to, is Bill Gates really a charitable guy? I don't know. Right. So another thing, though, that has been admitted in mainstream press is that JP Morgan, Jeffrey Epstein, and Bill Gates were in talks to create a charitable global health fund. Right. So kind of interesting that that's the kind of person that Bill Gates would want to tap to advance global health goals, like he says. And if you look at what the Bill Gates Foundation does, I mean, they have a lot of ties to pharmaceutical companies. There's, it's very focused on vaccines, which is a huge moneymaker for pharmaceuticals, but not focused on other aspects of healthcare, clean water supplies or anything like that. It's all vaccines, including the oral polio vaccine that contains live polio virus and now creates more polio cases than the disease itself does in the wild. What do you know, right? So I think, in my opinion, there's a couple ulterior motives there with Bill Gates. Bill Gates also flew on Epstein's plane, and there's a lot of other disturbing ties there. He was clearly involved with him after he was, outed after his first arrest and all of this. Why you would associate with someone like that, I don't know. Bill Gates' official excuse is that Jeffrey Epstein knew a lot of rich people. So that's why, I wanted him to donate things on my behalf. That makes no sense. Bill Gates is like one of the richest men in the entire world, and he has a hard time meeting rich people that he's, been exclusively associating with for decades since he's been a billionaire. I mean, please, it doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, if you decide to use critical thinking, you can come up with a couple different scenarios of why Bill Gates might have been interested in Jeffrey Epstein. I would argue they had similar scientific interests because a lot of pictures showing Epstein and Gates together. There's another guy there named Boris Nikolic, who was the former advisor for the science advisor for the Bill Gates Foundation. And he's into transhumanism and all this stuff. So was Epstein. Epstein was also into eugenics. This was reported by mainstream media. Epstein thought his genes were so superior that he wanted to take a lot of these girls that were essentially kidnapped and raped constantly and force them to have his children so that he could seed the human race with his DNA. I mean, what a sick dude. But apparently Bill Gates' top scientific advisor is, so close to Epstein that he ends up being named the backup executor of Epstein's will. the guys ahead of Boris Nikolic in terms of executing the will, Darren Indyke, who is Epstein's like super close legal associate for like decades and decades, and Epstein's brother. So, you know, apparently Boris Nikolic is in that type of orbit with Epstein. Very disconcerting, I would say. And there's a couple other things we could go to in there in terms of the Gates ties. But to go back to Trump for a second, I would argue if you actually look at what Epstein and Wexner were doing in Manhattan specifically from the 1980s through the 1990s, I argue, well, I'll be arguing this in my book, really. I haven't done a full article on it yet. But the ties between Trump and Epstein have to do with money laundering and real estate. Trump and money laundering and real estate has been reported in mainstream media. It's also what Wexner and Epstein were doing for a long time. It's also what this guy, Tom Barrack of Colony Capital, has been doing for a long time in the 1980s. Tom Barrack, Donald Trump, and Epstein were seen frequently together at nightclubs, partying together in the 1980s, so much that people called them like the Three Musketeers of Manhattan nightlife during that period of time. This is also a time, by the way, when Trump had bought the Plaza Hotel and was hosting all these parties, allegedly with girls as young as 12 there from people that were there, right? So I'm not just like making this up. And, you know, then you have people like Maria Farmer saying that she definitely thought Trump was a part of this, that he saw him coming in and out of Epstein's offices on a regular basis. It's back in 1995. And as I point out in my series, Donald Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, with whom Donald Trump would call as often as 17 times a day, was a pedophile and was running a sexual blackmail operation, and, you know, was admitted this to a New York police detective because he was so untouchable. Basically, he said, I run little boys, you know, and stuff like this. I mean, just really sick stuff. So this is the kind of environment that Donald Trump finds himself in. It makes sense too when you look at how the story over or the alleged reason behind the end of the friendship between Trump and Epstein, and had to do with a property in Palm Beach. There was a house that Epstein wanted to buy. He bought Trump to come, you know, look at it and get Trump's opinion. Then Trump buys the property so Epstein can't, and then flips it to some oligarch from, I think, Russia or somewhere like that, and sells it for like way more. And, you know, this guy that buys it doesn't even ever live in the house, and he like levels it. I mean, there's a lot of indications that that was another money laundering flip. And it just honestly seems like Trump scooped Epstein on that one, and then Epstein tried to set Trump up at Mar-a-Lago with an underage girl or something like that. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what went on, but it would make sense if you look at what they were both, you know, obviously into in the 1990s, which involved this real estate angle. And actually, the way that I found a lot of these scrubbed reports was because what I asked this university professor to search in LexisNexis was Jeffrey Epstein and property developer. Because in all of these old articles from 2001 and through the 1990s, every article that mentions Epstein doesn't refer to him as a billionaire or a hedge fund manager like a lot of the ones after 2001. They call him a property developer. And that's because during that period of time, he was known as that. He was involved in real estate. And there's been an explicit cover-up of that, and I would argue that's because it sort of reveals a lot of insight into the Donald Trump-Jeffrey Epstein relationship.
Yeah, so let's take first a look at Bill Gates. I want to make a couple comments on that, and then of course what you just said about Trump. One thing that I've been looking into recently, I mentioned to you that I'm working on an investigation into Fauci, into Bill Gates, and you know, he's out in front of everybody right now, and as you said, him and Epstein had interest apparently in global health, and here he is being the biggest funder of the World Health Organization. Yeah, exactly. And I found, and you might have seen these, they've been floating around recently on Twitter and elsewhere, but some old pictures of Bill Gates Sr., of Bill Gates' dad, of course, hanging out with the Rockefellers and George Soros and Ted Turner, who are all eugenicists, as well as Fauci, and a lot of old money, oligarch money. I mean, just going back to, I think this picture was taken in 1991. This original picture at some award they were receiving. They're all, and so this you know, uncovering of the Epstein network is, of course, for many of us, it's confirmation of what we've known for quite some time now, that there are these global networks, whatever name you want to give them, Illuminati, the conspiracy, capitalists, whatever name you want to ascribe to this group. The fact is they exist, and it involves organized crime in mafia, organized crime in government, organized crime in media, in so many different facets. And these people that are hanging around the same circles, like you said with Bill Gates, is a very weak excuse of, well, I was looking for, connections with the rich and wealthy because he's
The
so,
weakest excuse, dude.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the public takes it, and then 6 months later, Bill Gates is the hero of coronavirus, right? But I mean, the reality
Yeah.
is these networks exist. They're all interconnected. There's no way that these people could be hanging out and spending this amount of time together without being aware of what was going on, because it was and likely is so prevalent that Bill Gates can't be around Jeffrey Epstein since the 90s and having these business connections, real estate connections, without being aware of what was going on. My second point is to what you mentioned about Trump. Now, this is one of the areas where I imagine we probably already had some people sign off the interview because we dared, tie Trump to Epstein, and this is something I've
Yeah.
taken a lot of flack over the years. I actually was able to interview Brad Edwards about 2 years ago, who, of course, as you know, he's the attorney that was fighting for the
Right.
women since the original case. And, he said two interesting things. My interview with him went somewhat viral, and it was shared very much in Trump circles. I even had Fox News reach out to me and ask if they could play it, and I refused to let them play it because in the minds of some of the Trump supporters, this sort of exonerated Trump. What Edwards told me was that when he sent out subpoenas to different people, that Trump was the only one that responded and that like immediately called him and got on the phone and was willing to share whatever he could or help however he could about Epstein. Now, to me, that doesn't exonerate Trump because, as you said, they did have some kind of falling out at some point. I mean, it could be
Mhm.
over maybe arguments over these women because apparently Epstein and Trump, we heard about what Katie Johnson, has said in her lawsuit regarding that. There's also could be business arrangements gone wrong. But just the fact that Trump was willing to speak to Edwards doesn't exonerate Trump, first of all. And then the other thing is the claim that's often thrown around is that Trump had kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago. And I've done several reports on this, diving into that claim. And the claim the original claim for it that I found comes from James Patterson's book, Filthy Rich, which was written but with him and a couple of journalists. And that's where the claim originally comes from, him saying that there was a story at Mar-a-Lago and somebody came and told
Right.
them that Epstein tried to do this, pick up a young girl, and so Trump kicked him out. But that's the only original claim, and I've tried to contact both those journalists, and of course, looking into James Patterson, who was a neighbor of Epstein, he says he was just so disgusted with Epstein, he felt the need to write this book to expose his
Yeah.
neighbor. But he goes on book tours with Bill Clinton and writes a book with Bill Clinton, and
Can I
somewhat just
interject about
yes, please.
James Patterson? So, in the second part of the call with Maria Farmer, I haven't released yet, she talks a little bit about James Patterson. Apparently, he was so aggressive and trying to get her to interview with him that she ended up having to move cities. That he was just not as bad as Vicky Ward, because Vicky Ward told Ghislaine Maxwell that Maria Farmer was the first person to report her to the FBI for, crimes against children. So obviously that's way worse. But James Patterson is definitely up there in terms of like victim harassment. So, I would definitely take some of the things he has to say with a grain of salt because he definitely was not interested in the well-being of victims, and that tells you a lot. This Netflix series that's about to drop, he's going to make millions from it, and this is the type of things he did to victims like Maria Farmer, harass them constantly until they had to upend their entire life and move. I mean, just sick, honestly.
Wow. Is he going to
Yeah.
release a Netflix series on Epstein?
Well, there's a Netflix series that's being made that's based on his book Filthy Rich that
Okay,
some of the victims are participating in. Yeah.
gotcha. Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to bring that up because again, I know that there's going to be a comment. No, Trump kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago, and I've dove into it two different times, exploring all the different angles and the weak aspect of the claim that it's not very sound at all, and it's also is convenient the timing of that story starting to circulate. It seemed to start circulating. That book, Filthy Rich, I think came out 2015, maybe 2016, and then of course Trump runs,
Hmm.
and the story starts to be
Right.
spread everywhere right as Trump needs it to kind of provide cover for him. But I mean, even if we were to believe that story, there's still decades worth of a relationship between these two men. And again, you couldn't have been around Epstein this often. And Trump's own quotes, he knew Epstein liked young girls, or he said it himself that he liked them on the younger side. So there's just
Yeah.
so many angles to this that you can't be honest with yourself and come away and say that this is just about the Clintons, or just about, okay, well, maybe I'll accept Wexner, or maybe
Yeah,
I'll
that's
accept
the
Gates and
limited
Prince
hangout
Andrew.
side about Epstein is that there ever since the story broke last year in a big way, the story's been around for much longer than that. But since then, especially, it was, pushed into the left-right paradigm right away. Oh, let's look at Trump and Epstein. Oh, look at Clinton and Epstein, instead of looking at the whole, swamp together and showing how bipartisan and, infested the whole system is with this crap, right? In terms of the Mar-a-Lago accusation, what I mentioned earlier about Epstein and Trump having this falling out over this property, to flip for apparent money laundering purposes. Epstein apparently tried to set up Trump after that, and that's apparently when he kicked him out, from what I understand. So it wasn't like a kick out, like, you're a bad guy and you're doing this activity and I don't want it here. No, that's not true. I mean, people like Virginia Roberts and other people were recruited out of Mar-a-Lago by Ghislaine Maxwell. So apparently the kicking out story has to do with Trump kicking out Epstein for selfish reasons, because Epstein was trying to get back at him for this other, incident with the property before then. So it's definitely not like Trump is a white hat and he's going to take down the pedophiles and look what he did to Epstein. That's not what this is about. That was about, Trump's self-preservation and having this falling out with Epstein, who was like one of his best pals, from the mid 80s all the way until like the early 2000s.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question before we move on to your next article, Whitney. And just I guess this is more your personal thoughts, unless you have done some journalistic work on this, because one of the things that I think I even saw a comment this morning on my recent video on Epstein and mentioning Trump. Somebody said, I think you're totally wrong about Trump because, and this is something often repeated, because under Trump, there have been more arrests of pedophiles and human trafficking than ever. And I always ask, just very clearly and plainly, can you please provide me anything that points directly to something Trump did? And, I've seen the Trump executive order on human trafficking and there's a couple other things like that. But there's nothing that I've found that can conclusively show Trump did this action and this led to this pedophile being arrested. Or, again, they try to say, well, Epstein, of course, Epstein wasn't arrested under Obama. Epstein was, and this is, again, the left-right paradigm. But is there any evidence that you've seen that Nexium, Epstein, these other cases have anything to do with Trump being president?
Okay, so apparently, according to what Maria Farmer told me, because she knew Epstein was going to be arrested in June of last year, several weeks before he was actually arrested, and this was because there were apparently a small group of detectives with NYPD who were determined to go after Epstein after some statutes in New York changed that allowed them to do so. And that, Jeffrey Berman, who was like the head of that Southern District of New York, was reluctant to do so and only really did it to try and get these detectives off the trail. And it was a way to sort of to like close the case down. And do it in a sort of controlled way to keep these guys from really unraveling it. I mean, that's how Maria described it. I personally thought it had to do with Jeffrey Epstein's money laundering usefulness to intelligence running its course because of a change in U.S. law that basically allowed the government to launder its own money in a very secretive way by having private budgets and then that are different from the ones that are publicly released. If you want to know more about that, I'd look at the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and her interview with James Corbett and some other stuff like that. I'm blanking on the exact name of the change, but that was my original belief. But apparently it had to, according to Maria, it had to do with that. It could be both. I mean, who really knows? So in terms of why he was arrested, it appeared to have to do with that, not with it coming from anywhere at the top. Right. In terms of Nexium, I'm not sure about the motivations behind that. But honestly, I mean, that was, had a lot of involvement with the Bronfman family. Like I mentioned earlier, they're part of this syndicate or whatever. And the dirty laundry of the Bronfman family was not aired out really there. It was more focused on this ringleader guy, Rainier, or whatever his name was, that ended up taking the fall. And we haven't heard a lot about Nexium or a lot of other shady ties there lately. I think it sort of just got clamped down and has sort of been memory hold at this point. In terms of the amount of arrests that have taken place under Trump, it's really not the same than what it's basically the same amount in terms of sex trafficking arrests that took place under Obama. These have been happening under really every administration. Yes, there are arrests of people for sex trafficking and human trafficking. But I would argue that's because the real human traffickers in the United States are in bed with intelligence, and they're also in bed with military intelligence. And the people that get arrested are the small fries. and because the CIA and, these other government organizations that are involved in this, or government contractors like DynCorp and stuff like that, are known to do this type of trafficking as well. They don't like competition. And it's not just with trafficking, it's also with arms, gun running. It's also with drug trafficking. If someone, tries to get a piece of their pie, they get them arrested and they get them taken out and they consolidate control. If Trump was really interested in stopping human trafficking and he was mad at, Epstein, like everyone, wants to believe, kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago, he's a good guy. I mean, why did William Barr oversee this ridiculous cover up of what really happened to Epstein in prison? Why are Ghislaine Maxwell and Leslie Wexner and every other co-conspirator allowed to walk free? Why has there not even really been a blip about that in mainstream media? You would think that they would be blaring just how criminal that is if this was really a motive for the administration, and it's clearly not, in my opinion. So honestly, those would be my opinions about those particular points you brought up. I don't really think it has to do with Trump. I think it's just business as usual, because the real human traffickers have not been brought to justice. The Epstein scandal is one example of that. But we also know that there's a lot of labor trafficking in the U.S., that Epstein, if you listen to my call with Maria Farmer, was involved in not just sex trafficking, but basically slave trafficking, stealing women from the Philippines and forcing them to be maids in his various houses. This is something that happens all over the world. Epstein's network of trafficking was not just the United States, it was global. People forget about that. So it's definitely not coming to light under Trump. It's, Maria Farmer had to come to someone like me to get a lot of her story out. I mean, what does that tell you? Mainstream media is complicit. The FBI is complicit. I mean, the government in general is complicit. And it's because these, organizations at the core of what the government really does that are doing all this trafficking, they don't want competition. End of story.
Absolutely. And you're right. While the smaller groups of people, or the small individuals who play a very little role, are arrested and then propped up in front of the people, we have the criminals in government who are allowed to go free. And yeah, I mean, we haven't even touched on it today, but of course, William Barr played a role in this whole cover up, and he's been covering things up for decades. And I mean, it's
decades and decades.
There's no way to look at Trump or his administration or the people he's surrounding himself with and to say this is a good guy, unless you are willingly, just willfully ignorant, and we'll have to leave there on that. But to not get stuck to the left-right paradigm, let's talk about the Clintons for a moment, because this is something that does affect both parties, and this is not just about bashing Trump or being negative or some of the things people like to say. This is about exposing the truth, and the truth is that it involves people from both parties, both sides of the fake political spectrum. So let's look at your article, From Spook Air to the Lolita Express, the genesis and evolution of the Jeffrey Epstein-Bill Clinton relationship. And some of the basics that my audience will be familiar with is, of course, the Clintons flying on Epstein's planes, those sort of things. But I know you went much deeper than that. So let's talk about this. And this is coming from August 2019. So let's dive in here.
All right. So, I have some new information based on my conversation with Maria about the Bill Clinton relationship. If you read mainstream media reports, they basically tell you the Jeffrey Epstein-Bill Clinton relationship began sometime after Bill Clinton left office. This is a lie. Definitely a lie. After he was arrested last year, it started to come out, mostly like the Daily Beast and some other outlets like that were reporting this. They found records of Epstein visiting the White House as early as 1993 when Bill Clinton was in office. He was meeting with the deputy chief of staff and some other people. So, that's pretty interesting. He was also attending donor dinners with Ghislaine Maxwell during that period of time. He also, in this period of time, had already established a very close relationship with Lynn Forrester, now Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, who was a longtime Clinton donor and supporter, going back to when he was, governor of Arkansas, right? Lynn Forrester de Rothschild in 1995 wrote a letter that is now, public record, where she says, "Hey, Bill, it was great to see you at this senator's house. I only had time to talk to you about two issues, currency stabilization and Jeffrey Epstein." And then said that she wanted to touch base with him on a couple other issues she didn't get to mention. Okay, so one of Clinton's top donors is talking to Clinton in 1995 about Jeffrey Epstein explicitly. So for Bill Clinton to say, "Oh, I didn't know the guy until way later," doesn't make any sense. And the something that is just so explosive that Maria told me that I am just so shocked mainstream media would not follow up on is that she was forced to leave the premises of Epstein's residence in Manhattan because the president was coming. That's what Ghislaine Maxwell told her. And this happened 3 times just in 1995, that the president was coming to visit, and everyone had to clear out except for one employee, the personal chef, a guy named Andy Stewart, who just turned up dead a few weeks ago, and a bunch of girls, and then Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein. Everyone else had to leave. Okay, so you would think mainstream media would follow up on that, but they're not. And that, I think that tells you a lot, because the fact that a sitting president was visiting Epstein when he was in full swing of the sexual blackmail operation is huge, and it has just been not reported. And I just wow. Also, we know from people that met Epstein in the 1980s that were working with Israeli military intelligence at that time with Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, like Ari Ben Menashe. He says that the reason Epstein's sexual blackmail operation was set up is because Israel's government was concerned that Bill Clinton would be like Jimmy Carter and try and force Israel to make peace with Palestine, and go back to like the agreements pre-1967 and things like this that Israel's government did not want to do. Of course, in this period of time, it's sort of dominated. Since the early 70s, Israel had been basically dominated by Likud party politics, which are all about basically, greater Israel and annexing the whole West Bank and all of this stuff. So any sort of territorial loss, giving that to the Palestinians, was something they openly did not want to do, right? So apparently this was supposed to entrap not just Clinton, but other people in the Democratic Party specifically, in order to have those politicians basically toe the line that Israel wanted them to with respect to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is why it's interesting that you see senators like George Mitchell and Secretary of Energy under Bill Clinton, later governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, also get really involved with Epstein's shady activity, get accused, by people like Virginia Roberts, and get, name dropped by other victims as well. So it really seems like there was a specific effort to target Bill Clinton by Israel in terms of sexual blackmail, but also we know, Israeli intelligence companies like Amdocs tapped the White House phone lines, and it was Benjamin Netanyahu that had the earliest phone calls of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and used that as leverage over Clinton to try and get him to do stuff, right? I mean, this is like all come out in recent years, but hasn't really been widely reported by mainstream media. And a lot of people point to this type of blackmail, whether it's tapping the phone lines or Jeffrey Epstein, as to why Bill Clinton ended up pardoning people like Mark Rich in 2000, who Mark Rich is a longtime collaborator and asset for the Mossad that ran Glencore, which is now owned by the Rothschild family. He was not supposed to be pardoned. It was considered super outrageous, the fact that he was pardoned. But Clinton did it right before he left office. And apparently one of the reasons he did so was because people like Ehud Barak were heard screaming at him. And this is from other Israeli government officials, by the way. They were screaming at Ehud Barak was heard screaming at Bill Clinton to pardon Mark Rich. Like, that's so crazy that this other former prime minister is yelling at the U.S. president, telling him what to do. I mean, it's just really wild. So for people that think that Israel is just an arm of the U.S. empire and doesn't have his own agenda, I mean, how do you explain that type of activity and this type of espionage that, Israel has done targeting the United States and its foreign policy decision making? I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there's definitely something else going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask you about that. There's, of course, in the mainstream media, in the dialogue, anytime somebody points a finger at Israel, you're anti-Semitic, you're racist, something along those lines. But I mean, it's clear that there is for lack of a better term, a Zionist movement that is not just like some folks, as you just said, see the U.S. as kind of superior to Israel and power. But it honestly, the more you dig into it, it seems the reverse, that this small nation, that we're supposed to protect, it's constantly under threat, with all their nuclear weapons and all their technology and all their connections and intelligence arms and working with other nations like the UK and the US, that Israel seems to be in control of this, or at least elements of the Israeli government, let's say, or elements of the Israeli intelligence. But what are your thoughts on that? The part of the independent alternative media that had that push towards Zionism as the kind of top of the pyramid, if you will. What are your thoughts on that in relation to what you found about Epstein?
I'm not really sure how to answer that. So you mean like Zionism? Could you rephrase the question? I'm a little confused by
Well,
what.
what I mean is that, folks who point a finger at like the power of, let's say, the transnational, supranational groups, the mega group, that most of them have connections to Israel, right? And so there are
Right.
folks in the independent media who, I'm not saying that, like, there are some people who get accused of being anti-Semitic just for saying that Israel is behind 9/11, for example, or Israel played a role in 9/11, or Israel. There's the fingerprints of Israel all over many important events for the last couple of
Right.
decades in the United States and around the world. And I guess I'm just trying to get your thoughts on that. Like, does that mean anything to you to keep seeing these connections? Do you think that should
Oh
be a
yeah.
focal point more
Okay.
often for us?
Yeah, well, I think the fact that this gets so frequently dismissed as anti-Semitism is really telling because if you look at the facts, the history of Israeli espionage against the United States or past actions of Israel with respect to the U.S., the USS Liberty, the stealing of nuclear secrets so Israel could build its nuclear weapons program, John F. Kennedy being a major obstacle to Israel's nuclear program and wanting that to be investigated and all of this stuff. I mean, there is a lot of interesting and very clear involvement of the Israeli intelligence apparatus in attempting to sway U.S. foreign policy decision making. And I think if you look at that history as a whole, going back to the beginnings of Mossad, it kind of makes sense now why we give like $3.8 billion a year to this little country that has committed crimes against the US. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein in and of itself. I mean, the fact that there is a guy that on behalf of a foreign power, he's technically an American citizen, he's sexually trafficking and raping thousands and thousands of American girls with the purpose of getting control over US politicians and making them beholden to the interests of a foreign power. Why the hell are we giving them their military, because this was military intelligence right behind Epstein. Why are we giving them $3.8 billion a year? I think that is a testament to the success of the Epstein operation. But also, at this point, blackmail. You don't need someone like Epstein anymore. Israel's intelligence and technology capabilities, they have a backdoor into so much stuff. Like I mentioned earlier, there's been this effort to sort of merge a lot of Israeli tech companies with U.S. tech companies, and they have a lot of ties to, the intelligence apparatus of both countries. I mean, they can get pretty much anyone's communications they really want. I mean, they have a backdoor into so much stuff in the US. So, I mean, do you really need to set up a guy with, underage girls? You can just, read all his emails and find something in there, right? So, in terms of the technology side, this is something that they've been doing, since the 1980s and arguably before. Robert Maxwell was involved with the Promise software, which of course had a backdoor for Israeli intelligence, also for the CIA, that was marketed all over the world. It was also installed, the one with the Israeli backdoor specifically installed at sensitive U.S. laboratories like Los Alamos and others. That was Robert Maxwell that did all of that. And then his daughter gets involved with, sexual blackmail in the United States. I mean, these are very far-reaching operations. And just really, it's very disconcerting. Also, AIPAC, another group that you can't really criticize without being accused of anti-Semitism. They have been caught in espionage scandals time and time again. In the 1980s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, one of the people involved in that more recent AIPAC espionage scandal, David Satterfield, is now the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. And he was previously a big guy at the State Department under Trump. So he got rewarded for that, basically. No one went to prison, really, except for one guy who wasn't the AIPAC guys involved. He was I'm blanking on his name, but he was like some U.S. military analyst or something. And then you have, of course, Jonathan Pollard, who is one of the most successful spies to transfer secret U.S. secrets to Israel. He went to prison, but Israel lobbied really hard to get him released. And Bill Clinton actually almost released him, but he didn't because George Tenet, who was CIA director, said that he would resign and make a big stink if they let Pollard out. So that sort of, I guess, left Bill Clinton's hands tied, but he actually was going to go along with it. So, there's just if Israel is just an arm of the U.S. empire and does whatever the U.S. empire wants, I mean, how do you explain this aggressive espionage, this aggressive lobbying campaign? Because you see AIPAC say that they just openly say now, like with Bernie Sanders, who's a Jewish guy, right? We're going to destroy the candidacy of any candidate that doesn't support AIPAC and our objectives. Right. And they even, they even said in Israeli media, like AIPAC has to stop Bernie Sanders. That was like a direct headline. Right. I mean, they don't even hide it anymore. The Israel lobby in the UK did this to Jeremy Corbyn, but they've been doing this for a long time. I mean, it's super aggressive. And it's all about allowing them to basically quash Palestinian rights and violate international law with impunity, among other objectives of theirs. I mean, it's just honestly a very dangerous situation. And a lot of times people don't want to talk about it because I think there's a problem in alternative media with that. There's some people who view this as a career. They're not necessarily as committed as others to the information and the content and getting the truth out there. They're more interested in their ascendancy or building their brand, not getting censored. Remember, you have groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which is basically an arm of the pro-Israel lobby involved in YouTube censorship, deciding which channels to censor. So a lot of people, make that decision. Well, it's safer not to talk about these issues, right? But in my opinion, it's essential we talk about them because the mainstream media doesn't. So it's independent media's job to do that. And, people that are scared to do that, I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely not one of those people. I think this stuff has to be called out because otherwise, how are we going to know what's really going on if we can't really identify what the problems are,
Absolutely. And, 100% doing what you do and what I strive for, and a few others who I think in the independent media truly are independent and trying to go for the truth is important. And it's actual fearless journalism, not controlled opposition journalism. And you
Right.
mentioned the ADL and some of those other groups. I mean, that is that kind of nexus of their attack dog, for anybody who challenges Israel in these different ways. And so it's all interconnected. We've covered a lot of information in the last hour, and I really do hope everybody will give this interview multiple listens. And every article that we did cover today, we will be linking to. And then I'll also link, Whitney, to your newer stuff for Last American Vagabond. And one last thing I want to ask you, I know that you have mentioned that you're working on your book with about Jeffrey Epstein. Is there anything that you can share about that at the moment? I know you've got a lot of other stuff going, but we're sure you will complete it on time. But yeah, what can you tell us about the book and what's happening with that?
All right, so I'm hoping to have a manuscript done of the whole thing by the end of June. It ideally will be out this fall. If you want to support my efforts to write that book, you can support me on Patreon. That Patreon basically exists so I can take off time from my normal writing job and be able to feed myself and my kid, why I spend time writing the book because I need to, sit down for a couple months and just, finish what's left of it. Right. So some progress has been made. I'm just basically, in a lot of ways trying to expand what my series focused on. So basically what the book focuses on are Jeffrey Epstein's ties to intelligence and the history of these types of sexual blackmail operations in the United States. Because if you look at the history, it becomes really clear that Epstein was part of this larger network of sexual blackmail operations that have existed in the U.S. since the 1920s that trace back to this national crime syndicate. Even though he was working for Israeli intelligence, the mega group is that same syndicate that's been using sexual blackmail to control politicians since the 1930s, really. And this is, the consequences of the impunity for those people, if they've been doing it since the 30s, they're doing it now. It's not something that stops with Epstein, basically. So it's really important to understand how we got to Epstein in order to understand the significance of that scandal, right? Because there are ties between this Epstein, the Epstein network. There's ties to the Franklin scandal. There's ties to the sexual blackmail operation of the White House call boys that was run by Craig Spence. In the 1980s. I mean, the ties are just very extensive, and a lot of that history has been forgotten. And I think people, need to realize how deep this goes in order for us to be able to identify where this type of behavior is really coming from. And it's coming from the fact that our intelligence agencies have been in bed with organized crime for decades and decades and decades. And us, even though intelligence agencies say that they're here to help protect us and it's about national security, they themselves operate as organized crime syndicates. The CIA is an organized criminal organization. They do drug trafficking, human trafficking, gun running, you name it. Just look at Iran-Contra. There's numerous other scandals of the CIA doing stuff like that, right? Their currency is secrecy, and it's blackmail. And it's not just the CIA that's like this. It's Mossad that's like this. It's pretty much every intelligence agency on the planet. In the U.S., the CIA and the intelligence apparatus in a big way is really the real government. If you look at, Kennedy and all the presidents since then, whether it's Democrat or Republican, not much changes. And that's because the real power in the U.S. does not lie with who is president. It lies with these organized criminals that rule over us. And this is crucial to understand so that people stop buying into the left-right paradigm. It is fake. Both parties are controlled by these same people that were really behind Epstein and all of this mess. And this is who sets policy. And until people start to realize this on a massive scale, we will be just walking further and further into this nightmare that these criminals are creating for us. So to add to something you said recently, people may, take in this information and feel overwhelmed or like, this is scary. But what I want to point out, a point I brought up earlier, a lot of these control systems they're trying to roll out, they're using coronavirus because people are scared. Last year it was mass shootings. That's because they want your consent, right? They are scared of the people not consenting and standing up. That means that they are scared of you. The real power lies with us. They would not be trying to get our consent for this stuff if they didn't need it. Right. So it is crucial to not ever give them consent for these types of systems and to expose that to people because your consent actually matters. Otherwise, they wouldn't try and do this stuff. Right. And then the other point you brought up, it is so important to divest from the system. What they are saying now and what we're seeing now with this huge mass surveillance push is that they're calling data the new oil. A lot of people may have heard this recently. And I think it's no coincidence that we're also seeing the oil market completely collapse while they're trying to remake the economy and introduce artificial intelligence and all the stuff into it. The best way to fight that then is to deprive them of your data, stop giving it to them, basically, and find ways to not need a smartphone or anything else. Why we're still in this age of the internet and we can get this information, out through these channels. I mean, obviously we have to do that, but people need to make plans to cut these guys off when the time comes and not give them their data because then they can't make money off of you, and you can, stick it to them in their new systems, I guess, by not giving them the stuff that they want, because that's essentially where all this is going. They want your data, regardless if it's what you think or what you put in social media or even, what this body sensor stuff they're trying to push through with DARPA under coronavirus right now. I mean, they just want to harvest you as for data, and you can say no. But you have to make a conscious choice that you're going to say no and figure out how you're going to say no. And people need to start doing that now.